Dear subscribers, as you know, we shared many information for you, and we are studying very hard to find current news for you. However, I cannot use this channel for future. Please follow our new channel called as Daily News Report and watch our video to support us. Link in description. Also, you can reach the video we shared on Daily News Report by clicking on the top right button. We highly recommend watching, subscribing and sharing. We will continue to share some news on this channel, but we take precautions against some situations for future. Thank you for supporting us.
Who said what the whole point was when right after 9/11 he walked into the pentagram, or as they call it, the Pentagon, and was passed a note from one of the people there saying that they're going to take over and occupy 7 different countries in the next 5 years. And on that list were many of the countries that you just named. So they're progressing on their plan. Of course, on those list of countries, of course, was Afghanistan, Iraq. They've done those. Libya, they've done that. Syria was on it. They're still trying to do that, but finally getting some pushback from places like Russia, as well as people just waking up and starting to realize what's going on. This is a plan that's been in place for a long time. In fact, it was from the Project for a New American Century a year before 9/11, where they said they needed a new Pearl Harbor, and that was people like Donald Rumsfeld and Paul Wolfowitz, and essentially Dick Cheney and people who were essentially behind 9/11. And so this has been in process for a while. It even goes even further back with the Cold War with Russia, which was mostly all made up by people like this exact same people, Donald Rumsfeld and people like that, because they believe that the U.S. always needs an enemy because they're part of the military-industrial complex and they want constant war, and they've been getting that. The U.S. is almost constantly at war, and not really war so much as occupations and destroying countries, and so that's what's going on, and it's been speeding up a lot in the last year or so. And now it's getting very dangerous, in my opinion, because how many countries are flying around in Syria right now? It's Russia, Iran, I believe, is flying around. Israel is flying around. The U.S., now the UK's there. France, I believe, was just flying around and bombing people there in the last few weeks. So this is really looking like this is where World War III type scenario is going to start, and actually not a lot of people are really even talking about it, with the Russian airliner being shot down and then the Russian jet being shot down by a NATO member, Turkey. This is incredibly dangerous. It could just take one accident or one mistake to set off a massive amount of war.
We see what's happening in Syria right now, and we have all these countries in Syria. Do you think the U.S. is really going after the Islamic State, or do you think they're really trying to kick up a war?
Well, they started the Islamic State, so obviously not. They also started Al-Qaeda. That was a CIA. That meant the base. It was a bunch of old CIA assets in Afghanistan, including Osama bin Laden, and then they blamed them on all sorts of things, and then attacked Afghanistan and Iraq. And so ISIS was actually started by Dick Cheney. There's numerous photos. This has all been documented and talked about. And in fact, there's many people inside the U.S. government and the U.S. military who all say that the U.S. started ISIS. So it's been very interesting because the U.S. of course says they're not trying to attack the Syrian government. They're trying to attack ISIS, but then Russia, and this all happened in the last few months, and Putin actually announced it at the end of September at the UN, which actually I was saying there was going to be a lot of stuff happening at the UN that month. And soon after that, he went and really actually attacked ISIS, which really made the U.S. mad because those are all their assets. They continually are dropping them supplies and arms. And so what's happened here is Putin really called the U.S.'s bluff, and for a period of time, they didn't really know what to do. And so that's why I say this is going to be possibly a huge disaster in that area, because you have so many different countries all bombing, and they say they're bombing the same people, but they're not. And some of the people that are being bombed, which are ISIS and people like that, are actually part of the U.S. military and CIA. So this is getting incredibly interesting and dangerous, and we're going to see what happens. But I don't see any way that this ends without more escalation.
We see the coalition forces in Syria. We see Russia working with Assad, and everything's coming to a head right now. And Putin is calling out Turkey about the oil smuggling that's going on. We know that Turkey shot down an Su-24, most likely under the orders of the U.S. And right now, is all of this to protect the petrodollar?
Well, it's hard to say. I think it goes much deeper than that, but definitely the petrodollar is a part of it. And there's a lot going on, of course, in the oil market. As we speak, it's hitting lows not seen since 2008. It's well below $40 right now at 37. And that is definitely a part of it. But I think the grand overall scheme is total domination by the U.S. military of the entire planet. That's why they have a bigger military budget than every other country on Earth combined, and have military bases all over the world, just spread in almost every corner of the world. There's a U.S. military base, and there's U.S. military bases all surrounding Iran and all around Russia. And of course, Iran was one of the last country listed on that list that Wesley Clark was given, that they wanted to take over. And finally, Russia and China are pushing back. So this is a real, this is much, much bigger than most people think. They think this just pockets of problems, but this is all tied in.
What do you think the purpose is? I mean, we see the Islamic State. We know this is created by the U.S., and most likely Israel is involved in that, and most likely other countries are all involved in creating this monster, the proxy army, to go after Assad. And then we see events happening, like in Canada, Australia. We see twice in France, and then we had one in San Bernardino in California. Why are they pushing these events, or why are they occurring? What do you think the reasoning is for this?
Well, from what I can tell, most of them are actually orchestrated by the U.S. government and the CIA. Of course, 9/11 was. That's been proven so many times. And that was done because, as I pointed out, these neocons and the people who are at the shadow government of the U.S. government, who you don't even see, and the central bankers, all want continual war, and they want to dominate the entire world militarily. And so they continually create these boogeymen, they create problems. ISIS didn't even exist a few years ago, and now it's the world's biggest problem. And if you look at some of the events, the Paris shooting, I know that the Charlie Hebdo has definitely been proven to be not what they said it was. It was totally staged. And the Paris, the most recent one, looks like it was quite staged as well. And then the San Bernardino, there's lots of questions about that. That just happened recently, so I haven't done any research into it, but there's lots of questions about that. So there's this is basically it's all being orchestrated by the U.S. government and the CIA to create fear, to continue their wars of aggression.
And do you also see it as them removing the rights of the people? Because as soon as it happened, the first time with Charlie Hebdo, and then the second time just recently, we see that, France went ahead and, pushed forward these state emergency draconian laws, basically giving the president power that he didn't have before. And we see this in Canada, where the laws have changed. We saw it in Australia. Do you think this push right now is to remove the rights of the people and try to take total control before this entire system implodes on itself?
Yeah, absolutely. Has been a plan for a long time to essentially destroy the U.S. economy and the Western economies and bring in a totalitarian government and then work towards a one world government, which is what they're working heavily on right now, to essentially control the entire planet and to keep people down. And as you pointed out, the Patriot Act, for example, in 9/11, that was written before 9/11, and it was like a phone book of rights being taken away from people, and that was put in right after 9/11. Same thing happened in France. They have a state of emergency that they say is now going to last forever, essentially, and that's what these people want. They're incredibly power hungry. They want to control people, and they've been working on it for a long time. Even in George Orwell, in his book 1984, he wrote about a lot of the stuff that's happening today, and so he was very involved. He was involved in the sort of the elites of that time, as was Aldous Huxley, who wrote Brave New World, and that's also happened. So both 1984 and Brave New World have both happened now. So this has been a plan in place for a long time. And then it combined, as you pointed out, they know that all this money printing and going into debt for all these decades is going to end very soon. And so they're preparing for a massive amount of unrest, a massive economic collapse, financial collapse, monetary collapse, and they're going to use this problem reaction solution to try to bring in a one world government, a one world currency, even a one world religion, and so that's what's going on right now. This is way, way bigger than most people know.
You talk about money printing and the economy, and we see China and Russia, they've been accumulating a huge amount of gold. The IMF just reported that they're going to give the green light for the yuan to become a reserve currency included in the SDR basket of currencies. And at this point, the U.S. has been trying to stop China from pushing ahead with their yuan. They stopped it a couple months back. But at this point, I think it's unstoppable. From your research and what you're seeing, do you see everything flowing from west to east at this point?
Yeah, that's a major part of what's going on. Of course, the reason that the West and people consider essentially the West being places like the U.S. and Western Europe, the reason they did so well over the last 100 years or even 200 years is because they had a lot of savings, a lot of capital, and they had a fair amount of freedom, and that created a huge amount of wealth. But in the last few decades, due to a number of things, including, and these are all planned, by the way, including things like central banking, the Federal Reserve, so for more than 100 years now, they've been hollowing out the economy by printing money, which destroys capital. Essentially, central banking is itself a tenet of communism, and all it mostly does is funnel money from the poorer people, or even the middle class, to the very financial elites who have most of the assets that actually gain from the inflation. Then you have things like the governments, and they're also socialists now, so this is a big change. In fact, China and Russia are much less communist or socialist than the U.S. today. So it's been a total shift that's been going on. So the U.S. and Europe has been running through all of its wealth gained over the last few centuries, in the last few decades. They're now heavily indebted. The U.S. government is now the most indebted country in the history of the world at $19 trillion and rising dramatically, and that's almost doubled since 2008. So that just shows just the trajectory of what's going on. And then he pointed out Russia and China. So the places that used to be the places that people would run from, there's actually people like Edward Snowden who run too. He actually defected from the U.S. So this is, in the past, you'd usually defect from the Soviet Union because it was so communist and tyrannical and go to the U.S. Now you have people defecting from the U.S. and going to Russia because they point out how tyrannical the U.S. is. And and of course as well, China has gone through a massive growth since they finally gave up on communism a few decades ago, and has grown dramatically. And the Chinese are notorious savers. So they've been doing all the things that the West used to do. Russia not as much as China, but Russia even as well. And Russia, of course, has far lower taxes. Excuse me, much less regulation than in the U.S. So those places have been growing dramatically. So a lot of the wealth of the world is transferring to the places that used to be communist. This is sort of a cycle that just keeps going on over and over throughout history, is places that are more free and more capitalist gain a tremendous amount of wealth, and then the socialists and the communists and even the fascists all come in and start to redistribute that wealth and destroy the capital. And then the old countries that used to be communist all fall apart, like the Soviet Union and China, and they can't be communist anymore because there is no wealth to distribute, and because of that they grow dramatically, and so that's what we're seeing now. So really the future, for the foreseeable future, is in the what you would call the East, in places like China, Russia, and even other places like Latin America, as opposed to the US and Europe. And Europe, I believe, is going to be absolutely decimated in the coming years.
Since China and Russia have been accumulating gold, how will this affect the gold, the precious metal market? I mean, why are they purchasing so much gold? I mean, what is their end game here?
Well, precious metals are still seen by most sane people as being excellent stores of value. And of course, many countries today don't have any gold, including Canada. They sold all their gold in the 80s. And the only thing backing the Canadian dollar right now is US dollars. And the only thing backing US dollars right now is absolutely nothing. The country's bankrupt. So, any sort of smarter area would accumulate gold. So that's what we've been seeing. India even, China, Russia, all accumulating gold, because that is a millennia-long store of wealth, whereas all these paper currencies, these fiat currencies backed by nothing since 1971, when Richard Nixon temporarily took the gold backing away from the dollar, are worth nothing. They're just pieces of paper with dead criminals printed on them. And we're seeing there's so much going on. And you pointed out the petrodollar earlier. People are moving away from the dollar, and the China and Russia are doing trade pacts around the world that don't include the dollar. So they're moving away from these pieces of paper. And once it hits a certain tipping point, it will absolutely destroy the U.S. And many people to this day still don't see it.
So do you think gold and silver and the other precious metals are going to increase in price? I mean, a lot of people are saying that, oh yeah, they're going to be going up to $5,000 an ounce, $10,000 an ounce, $20,000 an ounce. What do you see?
Well, I think at some point they're going to go to $1 billion an ounce, but $1 million won't buy you a Big Mac at a McDonald's. We're seeing negative interest rates now in Europe. We're seeing quantitative easing to infinity, and that's something I said in 2008. I said they're going to just print money now until the system dies. And they're putting in capital controls all over the place, and all over Europe they have capital controls. Even in the U.S. they have nefarious capital controls through things like FATCA. So it's almost impossible for a U.S. citizen to even get their assets outside of the U.S. now, because no one will accept them, because the U.S. government will attack almost anyone who tries to accept U.S. clients. They're just passing a law right now that if you owe taxes to the IRS, that you can't get a passport. So those are going to be travel controls. I think there's going to be a time, and I don't think it's very far away. I think we're talking less than 5 years easily, when you won't be able to buy gold or silver for U.S. dollars or any other fiat currency. They won't be accepted. They're going to very quickly hyperinflate, and I think it's going to happen very soon. I think the euro is going to be one of the first, and it might not even last through 2016 the way it's looking right now. And as that happens, people are going to start to wake up, and it's already very hard to buy precious metals. Over the summer, I tried to buy silver. There was hardly anywhere in the world to be found. And I spent a lot of time in Mexico, which is where most of the silver is mined, and you couldn't buy one silver coin at any of the normal places you would buy silver coins, including the mint and at the banks and places like that, all summer. They were out of them. And even to this day, it's very hard to find. And when you do find it, it's much higher than the paper price, which you see listed on things like the internet or on TV, because the paper price and the physical price are segregating dramatically. And so I think a lot of people buy things like the GLD ETF and think they own gold, but they don't. And they're going to find that out. So people need to be moving to get physical metals now while they still can. I don't think there's a lot of time left.
You did a video on the Shemitah, and back in August we saw the market fall like 1,000 points or so, maybe a little bit more, and then it was pumped back up, and today we actually see the market down today and I think it was down yesterday. Are we finished now with the Shemitah? Is everything okay? Was that it? Or do you think there's more coming?
Well, I should point out I started the Dollar Vigilante in 2010, and I said that within 5 to 10 years we will see major fiat currency collapse. So we're now just in 2015, so we're about halfway, and right at the point where I said it could start to begin. And it was only this summer when I realized some patterns, especially the 7-year cycle, which also could be called the Shemitah, and realized that in both almost every 7 years there's a major collapse, including 2001, 2008. And so this summer, for the first time, I put out a fairly short-term prediction. I said we will see a lot of crisis, chaos, and collapse begin in September. And I actually picked an exact date based on the Shemitah. And it was only, as you pointed out, about 2 weeks or less before that date that we saw major market collapses around the world. The third quarter itself was a terrible quarter all around the world. And as you pointed out, the Dow even dropped more than 1,000 points intraday, which was a record in late August. That was the beginning. And then right on September 13th, on that day, is when the Eurozone essentially began to collapse. That's when countries started putting up borders again and fences. And the Eurozone, the Schengen area, is hanging by a thread right now. And so there's been major changes. As of course, we talked about Syria earlier, where we've had major war actions going on since September. So I think a lot has happened. If you look around the world, since I made that prediction in July, in the last this year to date, there's 27 major global stock markets that have fallen dramatically. China down more than 30%, Germany 13%, Spain 15%, Brazil 22%, Colombia 30%, Peru 40%, and there's 27 of these. The U.S. hasn't fully rebounded from when it did have what I call now a pre-shock or pre-collapse in August, but I see every sign that this is about to go any time now, especially when you really look at almost most of the markets. They look exactly like 2007, 2008, before the U.S. stock markets crashed. Of course, oil now down below 40. That's what happened in 2008. The price of copper now is near $2. The last time it was that low was just before the crash of 2008. We're seeing all kinds of things, even from the Austrian economics, looking at the money supply growth. It has declined to the point where we could see a crack up here. All the commodities have crashed. We're seeing just massive changes, the massive crashes and collapses happening all over the place. And the U.S. market still hasn't crashed completely. And so I'm predicting that it still could even happen this year. And in fact, the last 2 days looks like it could be the beginning. I could be wrong. You know, it's impossible to predict exact dates and times, especially so short term. But I see every sign that we're very close to major chaos, catastrophe, and collapse. And the fact that a lot of people think that maybe everything's going to be okay, there's absolutely 0% chance of that based on everything that I look at.
A lot of people are talking about the collapse, and you did that video, and I talk about the collapse. How do you think this collapse is going to play out? Do you think the central bank is controlling it and they're going to bring it down when they want, or do you think they have no control and it's just going to collapse and they just won't be able to stop it?
That's hard to say. It's really hard to say if they have much control or not. Certainly in the past, 1929 was orchestrated by the Federal Reserve. The Great Depression, they printed a ton of money and then withdrew a ton of liquidity all in 1929 to cause that collapse, and then they bought up stocks at pennies on the dollar. So they did it back then. It's hard to say now if that's the plan exactly. But either way, I don't think they can stop what's going on. The amount of debt when in 2008, for example, that was very close to complete and utter destruction of the financial and monetary systems. And the only thing, even George Soros said in 2009 that the financial system collapsed, and all they're doing now is printing money to keep it alive. And that's what they've been doing. So the biggest problem in 2008 was a massive amount of debt and leverage. And all they've done since then is go into more debt and more leverage and more printing of money. The U.S. government, as I pointed out, has almost doubled their total national debt in that time, since 2008. The total amount of government debt around the world has increased by 50% since 2008. So now we're seeing they're going to have to put interest rates at zero or negative interest rates, which is unheard of and insane, just to make it so this system can keep going. Because if interest rates even rose to 2, 3, or 5%, which is not a massive amount, it would bankrupt every Western government.
You're saying they're going to negative interest rates what are they doing? They're trying to keep these markets and keep the economy moving along because they have no other alternative?
Essentially, yeah. The other alternative would be to allow interest rates to go to their free market levels, which in the late 1970s, when things almost did collapse again, but there wasn't enough government debt at that time for it to fully collapse. So Paul Volcker allowed the interest rates to rise to their natural market level, and that ended up being 18% at the time. Things are so much worse now that I think the natural market level would be way higher than 18%. But even at, let's say, 10% to make the numbers easy, the U.S. government has $19 trillion worth of debt. At 10%, that would be $1.9 trillion per year in interest payments alone. That's almost the total tax extortion, theft-based revenue of the U.S. government. So that would essentially bankrupt the U.S. government. Of course, the central banks and the governments are all combined and they work together. So they don't want to see that all collapse, or maybe not just yet, until they want to bring in their New World Order and their New World One World currency and things like that. So I don't know if they're exactly behind it or what. There's too many variables, and there's just no way to know and what amount of control they have. But they are backed into an absolute corner. It's been 9 years since the Federal Reserve increased interest rates. That is an insane amount of time, and still to this day, everyone worries and panics about a 0.25% interest rate hike. That's how tenuous this system is. That a 0.25% increase in interest rates, which is really nothing, could topple the entire system.
Going forward now, I mean, a lot of people talk about deflation. A lot of people talk about inflation. Where do you lean? Do you think it's going to be inflation, or do you think we're going to see deflation, or both?
Well, I think those terms need to be defined, because a lot of people say that the rise in prices is inflation, and I don't call that. I call that a symptom of inflation. I call inflation an increase in the money supply, and deflation a decrease in the money supply, and those cause price increases or decreases. And we've been seeing now that we've never had deflation for decades. I think the last time the U.S. Money supply decreased was in the 1950s. So we're going to have continued inflation, continued money printing. Most of the money printing today is all done just by quantitative easing, whereas in the past it was actually fractional reserve banking and lending out of money by commercial banks, and now it's mostly just printing of money. So they have really no option here if they want to keep this system going. There's absolutely no way they can allow interest rates to rise, and so they will do everything in their power to keep that going until they find the right time and possibly do what they did in 1929, and then they could possibly withdraw a lot of liquidity, and that would actually collapse everything, and then they would again buy everything up at pennies on the dollar, and then try to restart with a new, entirely new global system is essentially their goal.
How do you think this is going to play out? Like the everyday person on the street who, is going to work every day, not really paying attention to what's going on. What are they going to expect to see when this all starts to fall apart?
Well, I think the American people are going to have it the worst in many different ways. I think it's going to be ground zero for all of this. And the main reason is that your average American has absolutely no idea that this is happening or is even possible. And they've lived so long off of having the world reserve currency, the U.S. dollar, accepted around the world. So the U.S. has lived for a long time, for decades in fact, just off of that. So they didn't have to create a lot of wealth. They just could print money to make it seem like they had a fair amount of wealth. But there's so much debt now, including not just the government, but in personal debt. Everyone's in debt. The entire world's in debt. A lot of people ask, well, to who? Well, a lot of it's to the central banks. And so I think your average American is going to have no idea how bad this is going to get, and they're going to be in shock. And so, in my opinion, they're preparing for martial law. I think that's what Jade Helm was this summer. I didn't know what was up with Jade Helm, but I said this is very interesting that they're putting military vehicles. We're talking tanks, and we're talking thousands and thousands and thousands of them, aside from the billions of hollow point bullets that the U.S. government and Homeland Insecurity has been buying. They're preparing for civil unrest once this all goes down, because your average American has no idea. They still think they're the freest country in the world when they're one of the least free countries in the world today. They still think it's the wealthiest country in the world when it's one of the most bankrupt countries. Actually, it is the most bankrupt country in history. They think they still have a lot of wealth in the country because there's been a lot of money printing, and because people have still accept the U.S. dollar, they've been able to buy cheap goods from places like China and things like that. But that's going to change dramatically as the U.S. dollar goes down, and it will. So your average American will be left, the economy will be absolutely destroyed either way, no matter which way they go, whether they hyperinflate or they do a default on the debt of the government. Either way, it's going to destroy the U.S. economy, and your average American just doesn't have hardly any assets. I think the average American, middle class person, has $5,000 in net worth, and then when you add in the about $200,000 per person in the U.S. of U.S. government debt over top of it, they're at a negative $195,000 net worth. Your average family of four with it's about $250,000 per person in the U.S. When you do 19 trillion divided by 300 million, that's about, or actually it's more than that. With the debt and liabilities, it's about 85 trillion. So these are the things that have already been spent and borrowed, but need to be paid for in the future. It's about 85 trillion, and then when you do the 300 million calculation, it's about $250,000 per person in the U.S. of U.S. government debt and liabilities overhanging it. So every family of four has $1 million of U.S. government debt overhanging it. So this is essentially, a lot of people in the U.S. are still living in this bubble fantasy land, and thinking that everything's going to be okay. We're going to have, as Ben Bernanke said, a Goldilocks recovery, which I really liked because it is a fairy tale. There's not going to be any recovery. There's no way but down for the U.S. And most people aren't prepared at all. They have no savings. They definitely don't own precious metals. Your average person, if they do have savings, it's in dollars, which are going to massively devalue. So your average person is going to get very hurt, and there's going to be a lot of problems, especially in the U.S.
Let me ask you a final question here. How long do you think this collapse of the system will be? How long will the pain be?
Well, I think these things take a long time to happen, but when they start to happen, they go very fast. I don't think it's going to be more than a few years between the time that we go into crisis, which I think will probably happen in 2016, or even still this year. That's how sure I am of it. But definitely in 2016, I don't think you'll recognize the world by the end of 2016. Once it starts to happen, we'll see currency collapses all over. It could be the euro being first, Japanese yen could be next, and then as people panic, there'll be all sorts of incredible movements and intended movements of capital, and a lot of those will be blocked, and there'll be bank bail-ins, like we're in Cyprus, where the banks essentially, when they go under, because there's going to be so many bankruptcies and insolvencies, they're just going to take the money of their clients. This has actually been all written into law in the U.S. and Canada and Australia and Europe. After Cyprus, they all put in bank bail-in clauses where if the banks have problems, they can just take their clients' money. So once it starts to happen, it'll happen very fast. And as far as people, how long they have to go through the pain, well, that really depends. It depends on how quickly people can recover from a complete collapse and rebuild, and hopefully they can rebuild, and hopefully there is no big Big Brother, massive police state, 1984 Orwellian-style government, like in the U.S. Hopefully they go bankrupt as well, and allow free markets to act again. And once free markets are in place, and once there's capital can be created, and it's not stolen by inflation of the central banks or by regulations and taxes, you can build very quickly. But it's really going to depend. But people need to be prepared for it, and prepared now. And you can survive fairly well through it, as long as you're prepared, as long as you have your assets outside of the financial and monetary system, and preferably internationalized, so that your government can't steal it. Because as these governments go down, they take more and more from their own citizens. This happened continually over time, including when the U.S. government confiscated gold in 1933. If you're prepared for it, you can even profit immensely from it. So this is going to be a massive intergenerational wealth transfer for the people who are prepared.